Oh, okay. There'll be folks come on later, I think. Good morning and welcome to the forum. My name is Craig Volland. I'm a member of the Forum Committee. The forum's mission is to afford a platform for the discussion of significant issues, especially those which involve ethical values in the contemporary world, and to promote critical thinking. This morning, we have a very timely program. It's called The Social Construction of Crime and What We Can Do About It. And our speaker is Spencer Graves. He's a Vietnam-era veteran and holds a PhD in statistics, books, patents, published technical papers, and software used all over the world. He is also a licensed professional engineer. He is program associate for KKFI Community Radio and produces content for Radioactive Magazine, which broadcasts on Tuesday from 6 to 6:30 p.m. He is also president of Friends of Community Media and secretary of Peaceworks, Kansas City, and a member of the All Souls Forum Committee. Obviously a busy guy. The Vietnam War made a compulsive fact checker out of him, and he's been all over the political map, constantly looking for evidence to disprove current beliefs. Around 1999, he did a literature search for constructed reality. Key references from that search discussed social construction of crime, which is the main topic of today's presentation. So take it away, Spencer.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to try to share my screen here, and I've got slides that I'm going to share. That obviously the radio audience won't be able to see this, but in any case, I want to mention that this is actually my second time to speak to the forum. I spoke 2019, March 3rd on media and democracy in Kansas City and elsewhere. And I want to connect the themes that Craig mentioned with the media and with the evolution of income inequality and the evolution of the actually economic growth in the United States from 1790 to the present, and then put that all together and what we can do in Kansas City to improve the media, and through that to improve the prospects for broadly shared economic growth. There's a Wikipedia article entitled United States Incarceration Rate that has a plot of the percent of the population in state and federal prisons. Between 1925 and 1975, that was relatively stable at 0.1% of the US population. And in the last quarter of the 20th century, it shot up by a factor of basically 5, almost 5, cresting in 2006 or so at over 0.5% of the US population, and now it's down closer to 0.4%. But the question is, what drove that increase? And how did I come to even look at this? So my wife was a psychotherapeutic social worker, and she was talking to me in the 1990s about constructed reality. And so I did a literature search on constructed reality, and I came up with research papers talking about the social construction of crime. So let me talk about what's constructed reality. When we're born, our brains are a mass of neurons without knowing how to interpret the signals they receive. Gradually, these neurons make connections that allow us to do stuff. These connections are more unique than fingerprints, and they change over time. And in particular, in this context, everyone thinks they know more than they do. That statement that everyone thinks they know more than they do is a key element of a work that Daniel Kahneman did, for which he won the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics in 2002. But Kahneman is not an economist. He's a research psychologist. And starting in the 1970s, he and a collaborator named Amos Tversky invented all kinds of different ways of asking questions that exposed how fundamental defects in how people think and make decisions. And in the process of doing that, they invented basically a field, a subfield of both psychology and economics called behavioral economics. It's showing that the model that economists have been using for years of the rational person is not how people actually think. Okay, so that relates to the incarceration rate, because incarcerations are not driven by crime and people's actual experiences with crime. They're driven by what they get from the media. Okay, and the mainstream media everywhere exploit this fundamental defect that if people think they know more than they do, to benefit those who control the money for the media. And so around 1975, the mainstream commercial, the major commercial broadcasters in the United States began to fire nearly all the investigative journalists and replace them with the police blotter. So the public thought that crime was out of control when there had been no substantive change in crime to justify that change. They voted in a generation of politicians who got tough on crime, Lincoln sentencing and so forth and so on. Part of this was discriminatory. Crack cocaine was punished more severely than powder, because powder is a drug of choice of whites, and crack is more used among people of color. And this is the result. Now there's something else that started increasing about 1975, and that's income inequality. And my data on that starts in 1947 Census Bureau data that shows that the income distribution in the United States stayed basically stable while the average was increasing, but the distribution itself, the variability, income inequality, was stable from 1947 to 1970, and then it started increasing in 1970 or 75 or 1980, somewhere along in there. But before I talk more about that, I want to talk about the evolution of economic growth in the United States, the average annual income, real gross domestic product per capita adjusted for inflation. There's a website called measuringworth.com that has the data I like the best on this. Between 1790, when George Washington was president, to 1929, the US economy grew at an average of 1.5% per year. Then it fell like a rock during the 4 years at 8% per year during the 4 years of Herbert Hoover administration. And then it took off like a rocket during the 12 years of the Franklin Roosevelt administration, increasing at 8% per year then. And then there was a 2-year post-World War II recession that's not even mentioned in the history books, where it fell by 8% per year for 2 years. But everybody was flush with savings bonds and war bonds that they bought during World War II. And so the nation had a big party and nobody noticed the recession. Since then, the economy has grown at about 2% per year. And if you look at a plot of this on what is called log scale, a straight line looks like a constant percentage increase looks like a straight line. So we have this straight line that starts in 1790, runs to 1929, and then we have a zigzag period for Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt, and then we've got the post-war period that we're living in today. So I mentioned that to bring it back to the discussion of income. Basically, the average annual income since 1947 has, as I said, increased at 2% per year. And those gains were broadly shared until about 1970. Now, at that rate of increase, the average actually means that in the 40 years between 1970 and 2010, the average doubled. And I was involved with Occupy San Jose at that time, and so I kind of got interested in looking at this, and there was starting to be talk of income inequality. And so I did some analysis. The median line, 50% of the population is below the median and 50% is above, increased only 23%. Now this was family income. So in 1970, the median American family income in constant 2012 dollars was a little over $50,000. So if that had doubled, the median American family by 2010 would be making over 100,000, but they weren't. They were only making a little over 60,000. So that gap was 40,000. Round that down to 36,500. You've got $100 a day, $3,000 a month in income that people did not get because of increase in income inequality, because of increases in income inequality. If the gains in productivity growth since 1970 had been broadly shared, by 2010, the median American family would have been taking home more than $100 a day more money. All right, and I claim that that's money in essence that the typical American family pays to watch television. Now that may sound pretty silly, but that's what that's related to what the criminologist, the criminology professors talked about in the social construction of crime. To carry this a step further, news is in fact a public good, what economists call a public good. And that's because corruption, political corruption, is limited by what the public demands. And let me drive this point. If I know the perfect solution to crime, it's not going to benefit me a whit. Because I'm only going to get frustrated because nothing's likely to happen if I'm the only one who knows about it, right? If, on the other hand, a critical mass of the electorate knows and understands what to do to fix the crime problem in Kansas City in the United States of America, it will happen, whether I know it personally or not. My point is, you and I benefit from what others demand and have demanded in the past. And let me even say this, in fact, the position of the United States, the leadership position the United States enjoys on the international political economy is a result of the slow, steady economic growth that has occurred in the United States since 1790. So we benefit today from news published over 200 years ago that encouraged literacy and limited political corruption, both of which, as I said, helped the United States grow, while contemporary New Spain, Mexico fractured, shrank, and stagnated economically. My point on this is we need a diverse partisan press. And I stress the word partisan, that the concern for professional journalism, journalism scholar Robert McChesney says, and I think McChesney has spoken at All Souls, if I remember correctly, not necessarily the forum, but he's been here. In any case, McChesney says that the standards of professional journalism came in the early 20th century in a reaction to public complaints about yellow journalism that was being was a feature of the major newspaper chains of that day. Now let me go back and talk about crime data, and then I'll come and talk more about news. Okay, what's a crime? The definition of crime changes over time and between subcultures. Data on homicide is easiest to collect and compare, and other crimes often track with that. So with some effort, I managed to get data on homicide rate. They typically, people who study homicide in the modern era typically talk about the homicide rate per 100,000 people in the United States. And I've seen data on this since 1925. It was a little over, in 1925, it was a little over 8 per 100,000. It went up to almost 10 and then down to 4.2 or so. And in the late 1950s, and then during the beat, and especially the hippie movement and the youth culture, the baby boomers, it rose to over 10 per 100,000 and plateaued for a while. And then in the early 90s started to fall like a rock. And I've been reading, and it's since 2010 it started coming back up again. And I've been reading a book by a man named Steven Pinker on the better angels of our nature, that was the closing line in Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address. When he was southern states had already seceded, but the war had not yet begun, and he was hoping to avert a war, basically. So in any case, Pinker says that we don't know why all of these changes have occurred in the homicide rate. There's clearly some systemic things going on. If we look at the homicide rate in Canada and in Europe, they show the same general pattern, but at a lower level. Their homicides rate are 10 or 20% of ours, but they still show this same up and down pattern, which Pinker says, you know, there's the crime rate is more or less independent of the incarceration rate. So on this point now, I'd like to make a plug for next week's All Souls Forum. Melinda Henneberger, who's a columnist with the Kansas City Star, won a Pulitzer Prize recently for uncovering crime and corruption in Kansas City, Kansas. In fact, there's been some of the reporting on that noted that the FBI was concerned in 1992 that there was major problems in the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department, but they were frustrated because there did not seem to be the political will to do anything about it. So why was there no political will? My answer is the same phenomenon we've been talking about. If you're a journalist and you've got to get a news story for tonight's nightly news from the desk sergeant, you're going to think twice about reporting on questionable activities by some law enforcement officer, because the desk sergeant might not want to give you the story that you need to fill the time in the nightly news. And that could be a problem for not just you, but for your boss. Okay. So in any case, let's talk now about, let's go back to the media, and let's talk about the early 1800s. There's a man named Alexis de Tocqueville who visited the relatively new United States in 1831. Frenchman, he went back to France and wrote a book on democracy in America that has become a famous work since. In the United States, he noted that there are many, many newspapers. He said there's scarcely a hamlet that does not have its own newspaper, many readers, and many associations. And he says that that every newspaper had an association and vice versa. All right. Individually, he said these newspapers were very weak, but collectively they were very powerful. Contrast that with France. France had very few newspapers and very few associations, but the ones they did have were quite powerful. Robert McChesney, in 2004 book, The Problem of the Media, talked about this, and that's where I got the reference to Tocqueville. McChesney also talks about the U.S. Postal Service Act of 1792. Under that act, newspapers were delivered up to 100 miles for a penny and beyond for 1.5 cents, when first-class postage was between 6 and 25 cents. It was huge, and it created, McChesney insists, the vibrant newspaper industry that the brand new United States of America had, that Tocqueville saw. McChesney also said that Western Union came in 1951 and started stringing telegraph wires, and they denied access to the telegraph to competitors of the Associated Press. Why? Because they had a deal with the AP. The AP would not criticize major corporations, would not criticize the monopoly that Western Union became. And in this general bias in the news supported the increasing dominance of major corporations of the US political economy that produced the robber baron era of the 1890s and the early 20th century, and produced the situation today where major corporations export their profits, small businesses compete on price and quality, but small businesses pay taxes, big businesses compete on control of the media and the political process, and pay relatively little in taxes. In 2010, Robert McChesney joined with John Nichols in a book on Death and Life of American Journalism. And part of that book, they noted that this newspaper subsidy represented a little over 0.2% of GDP between 1840 and 1844. It was hard to get figures. They don't think the numbers for that particular year were particularly different from other periods. But in any case, then in just last December, McChesney and Nichols published a research report, and they included a discussion of newspapers as a percent of GDP compiled by the Pew Research. In 1956, newspaper revenue was a little over 1% of the national economy, and in 2021, it's less than 0.1%. And that's not the only thing that's driving the political polarization that we've seen in the United States today. I don't think they're not the only thing that's been cited in my research as driving the January 6th storming of the Capitol last year that tried to prevent the certification of Joe Biden as having won the 2020 election. But it is one important thing, and it's what I have time to talk about today. My point in this is investigative journalism is expensive, but ignorance is more expensive. So we have all kinds of stuff available on the internet right now, but we have relatively little investigative journalism, and that's a major problem. So last December, McChesney and Nichols published a paper in the an article in the Columbia Journalism Review and a tech report where they recommend distributing 0.15% of the national income, not 0.2%, just a little bit less than that, to local news nonprofits in proportion to votes in regular elections, with a maximum of 25% of funds going to any one local news nonprofit. And they said all the news reports produced with these funds should be online for free. Similar to the Beacon.media, Kelsey Ryan, a refugee from the shrinking star, founded the Beacon.media, and their policy is steal our stuff, just give us credit. So, and that's my vision of what McChesney and Nichols are recommending here. We need to support vigorous, diverse local news. All right, to qualify, you have to have a website. You have to publish something that you call news 5 days a week, and 75% of your salaries need to go to local journalists. So McChesney and Nichols want the federal government to fund this, and I'm saying, well, actually, we can fund this locally. U.S. GDP per capita is not quite $80,000 a year, 76,000, I think, when I looked recently, but let's call it 80,000. 0.15% of that is $120. The city budget for Kansas City, Missouri is over $3,000 per person per year. And 4% of that gives us $120, which is what McChesney and Nichols are recommending. This roughly matches what the nation spends on accounting, auditing, advertising, media, and public relations. And I don't know how much the city of Kansas City spends in these categories. I've tried to find out, and I've so far not been successful. But my point is, advertising for most of the 20th century was roughly 2% of GDP. And advertising is maybe often disinformation, all right, rather than, and propaganda rather than information. Similarly, accountants and auditors average roughly 1% of the workforce. Well, okay, so accountants and auditors make more than the average, and an accounting function includes people other than accountants, right? Support staff of various kinds. So let's call that 2%. So we got 2% for accounting and 2% for advertising. That's 4%. And I would say, by the way, in government services and in nonprofits, we routinely account for expenses to the last penny, but the accounting for results rarely gets more than lip service. So we do all kinds of experiments, basically, but we don't collect the data to find out how good they are, right? That's a major problem. We need to match what we spend on accounting with actual trying to understand the research, trying to understand the impact, what we actually got for that. And there's been some improvement in these areas. It's not all a negative, but we need more. So, and let me sort of reiterate a point that I kind of made earlier. Better media can pay for themselves. In fact, you remember, we live today, we benefit today from news stories published in the 19th century that limited political corruption and encouraged, promoted economic growth. So if we can do that today, it can potentially increase the rate of broadly shared economic growth locally, making our new nonprofit news media essentially free, paid from income that we would not have without it. In February 6th, Craig Aaron spoke to All Souls Forum, and they said that Craig Aaron was the co-CEO of freepress.net. He said in 2016, they started organizing town halls in every county in New Jersey, asking for people's concerns with local news, what they thought should be done about it, and what they're willing to do. In 2018, the New Jersey legislature, with bipartisan legislation, created something called the New Jersey Civic Information Consortium that tries to respond to these concerns. And in 2020, they actually funded it. The lesson for Kansas City, I'm recently elected president of Friends of Community Media, and I'm working with the News and Public Affairs Committee of KKFI. We're interested in organizing a similar series of town halls with different community organizations, not different counties, different community organizations in the greater metro area, asking what are people's concerns with local news, what do they think should be done, and what they're willing to do about it. So that's my program. To summarize something that I didn't quite say earlier, but hinted at, to reduce crime rates and to improve other problems, we need, number one, innovations that work. Number two, we need research documenting their effectiveness. Number three, we need media disseminating that information. And if we invest in nonprofit journalism, we're more likely to get more investigative journalism that are going to go out and do a little bit of research, and they're going to find the research that's there and disseminate it, where the mainstream media too often does not want to disseminate the research because it could offend a major advertiser. Or finally, I want to give a shameless plug for a couple of other things that I'm going to be doing in the near future that are somewhat related to this. So May 31st, Tuesday, Radioactive Magazine, 6 to 6:30 p.m. on 90.1 FM, KKFI. I'll be talking about RightsCon, an international online human rights conference that will take place June 6 to 10. It turns out that I'll be facilitating a workshop on June 9th in the Late Net Conference from 1:45 to 2:45 p.m. Central on using Wikipedia to advance human rights and democracy, using constructive conflict to create quality articles. The primary leader in this workshop is a woman named Luisina Ferrante, who is the Education and Human Rights Manager for Wikimedia Argentina. And she organized dozens of workshops throughout Latin America that trained hundreds of people on who uploaded thousands of images to Wikimedia Commons that were used in thousands of Wikipedia articles that got tens of thousands of views. And Patricia Diaz-Rubio, who's the executive director of Wikimedia Chile, said that this work in Chile helped to break a conspiracy of silence, exposing abuses of power, excessive use of force by Chilean security forces that contributed, made a major contribution, she said, to the 78% approval in a plebiscite for a process to rewrite the Constitution of Chile to replace the one written under the Pinochet dictatorship. That's huge. And last December, a 35-year-old former student activist got 56% of the vote to become president of Chile, defeating a right-winger who promised to prevent the new constitution from taking place. So I think I should thank you all very much for your attention, and I will turn it over to Craig.
Thank you, Spencer. That was very interesting. Before we go to questions and answers, I just want to mention that the forum requires some support in order to keep going. And there's two ways you can provide support to the forum. Go to the chat. You can either send in a contribution to the church by mail, or you can also do that by online. So I just want to mention that next week, which fits in perfectly to this presentation, we're going to have Melinda Hindenburger, that Spencer mentioned earlier, talking about uncovering crime and corruption in KCK, or Kansas City, Kansas. And Melinda actually recently won the Pulitzer Prize for her investigation. So I can't claim we knew that was going to happen, but it is very timely in following up on Spencer's talk. So now we're going to go into questions and answers. And if you want to be easily recognized, go to reactions down on the bottom of your screen, and you can hit the raise your hand. And so that's when I know I'll be able to determine. Okay, let's see who we have.
Lon Swearingen.
Right. Yeah, go ahead, Lon. You need to unmute, Lon. Still muted.
All right, there it goes. There it goes. No, what I have is a question. We do have the investigative reporters. We have people that give us information, such as Julian Assange. Now he's going to, if they extradite him here, he could get 175 years in prison. How do you block that kind of stuff? Even with a nonprofit concept for your newspaper and your inquiry into things.
Okay, my answer, we have that because of the massive consolidation of ownership of the media. If we have a more cacophonous press, the major commercial media will not be as easy for them to suppress discussion of things like that. That's my answer.
Okay.
I could be mistaken, but I think that's accurate.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, this is Craig. I'll go ahead and ask a question. I guess I want to repeat back to you what I think you were getting at. One is obviously that the decline of investigative journalism has created more of an opportunity for the economic interests who gain by the fact that we really don't know what's going on can continue, and that has led to inequality. Everybody knows economic inequality, and I think the example of Melinda Hindenburg's research on KCK is an example that nothing really is being done to improve the crime rate. But I wish you would go into a little more detail into, okay, let's say we did have better reporting. How would that, in your opinion, then result in lower crime? It's not quite clear to me why that would happen.
Okay, so there's a group called Youth Ambassadors Kansas City. I talked with a couple of the founders in 2016, I think, maybe 2017. They said that at that time they pay minimum wage to the kids with the worst home lives to stay after school for a couple of hours and come in for half a day on Saturday. They work to keep these kids in school and doing useful and interesting stuff and keeping them out of trouble. And they, at that time, when I spoke to them, they had like 500 kids through their program. And they claimed that one of them had had a negative encounter with law enforcement, 0 criminal convictions. That's huge if that's true. All right, I said, well, have you had research done to certify this? No, you need to get in conjunction with a college prof who will do the research to certify what you've done. We've had all kinds of, any number of other programs that are similar for that claim that they have kept the kids out of gangs and off the streets and out of prison. I want to believe. Please help thou mine unbelief. We need the research, and then we need the media that's willing to publish that stuff.
Okay, so it's really also and I think you said this at one point, we need this investment in research to determine what would really work.
Exactly.
And it's being impeded by the lack of research and the fact that certain economic interests are actually making more money in the way we have it set up now.
Exactly right. I'm talking to people about reentry programs. I know of more than one reentry program that's prisoners released from prison. If they get into the right kind of reentry program, they can have potentially the recidivism rate is much lower if they have the right reentry program. Otherwise, 80% of them go back to prison.
Okay, George, you're on.
Yes, your talk, I mean, that's a lot of information in this talk this morning. And I got multiple questions, but I'll stick with the one. As we listen to this, I'm curious about what kind of incentives could be put on corporations to demonstrate to them that some of this transition is in their better interest. And as an example, right now, major employers are having a tough time finding drivers and people to fill the jobs of people who don't want to work as much as they used to. And so they're having to suddenly face the fact that they may have to increase the wages to attract people that would work in these facilities. And so I see that now, and so then they say they're realizing it's in their better interest. So what kind of incentives could we put forward to increase the incentives for corporations to help do the right thing?
Well, I've got multiple answers to that. Number one, the mainstream media have a conflict of interest today in reporting on anything that happens in Washington or Jeff City or even the city of Kansas City that might negatively impact on a major advertiser. And that's especially through tax laws, EPA, so forth. So we need a more informed electorate, and if we have a better informed public, they're going to demand that the politicians do more and to redress the balance of power, where currently, as I said, small businesses pay taxes and big businesses compete on controlling the media and the political process and pay relatively little taxes. We need to reverse that. Also, I would say there's research that I've seen that basically says that worker cooperatives tend to, on average, to grow faster, but be more stable. And so this is like the tortoise and the hare story. If you got 100 turtles and 100 rabbits running 100 races, a rabbit is going to win every race, but half of the rabbits are never going to get to the finish line. Okay, the turtles are slow, steady. They're going to make it. All right, you want to support the turtles. In this case, you want to support democracies over autocratic governments. China had a terrible time from the founding of the People's Republic of China in the late 40s up until the early 70s, when they finally started opening their economy and participating more in the international economy. But we don't know if they're going to continue or not. All right. Their growth tends to have been more erratic. The growth of autocracies has been more erratic than the growth of democracies. And the same is true with major corporations versus cooperatives. Okay, the cooperatives tend to grow more stable and provide, and they don't have these. We don't have these bizarre situations like we had in 2008, where the senior executives of the major international banks gave themselves huge bonuses at taxpayer expense for crashing the international economy.
Oh, okay, we've got a question at the church. Go ahead.
Along that line, I think you've given so much information here, and I'm still struggling with one of those charts that's really full of information. And I'm a little disappointed in turnout today here online. So, and that's been true of a couple others this year, and I have missed some. I'm really thinking that we ought to be, that this ought to be aired again somehow. And I don't know what the mechanics of all this are and time and energy, but this summer again. And I'm looking at the calendar and going, could the forum have maybe 6 repeats this summer, the 2nd and 4th Sundays? Is there some way to do that isn't incredibly cumbersome? So programs that maybe got slided by their convergence with something like the annual meeting today or some other, church activity might get more members, or community members might get connected to them. So that's just, it's sort of a tangent, but it's because this just seems so important today that you know, it's another part of sharing information in the media and getting the word out.
So Bill Pierce, I'm not, that's not my issue. Bill Pierce and Teresa Wilkie are making the decisions on what fills the slots for this summer. And I don't know, more about that.
You're talking about KKFI when you say that? Yeah,
Yes.
and I'm talking about All Souls too. I'm
Oh,
talking about
okay, right.
Sundays at All Souls is a pattern of second and fourth Sundays.
Sure.
That
Well,
wouldn't hit the 4th
but
of July.
we could also, if the forum committee wants, we can have, another discussion about this in the fall or something.
Oh, I've got another, this is Craig, I've got another question. And it occurs to me that there's a parallel problem that's causing this, and that is money in politics. The combination of money in politics and television, which could account for this really deficit in information for the general public. And you know that corporations are under a silly Supreme Court decision or people, and there's a campaign to try to get rid of that, so that their money that they spend on politics is given the same credence as that people put in. So would you agree with that, that it's really even beyond what you're saying? It's also the corporate power, which goes through the television system, because everybody watches television.
Well, nearly everyone. I don't, but the answer is absolutely. The broadcasters, the commercial broadcasters, all have an inherent conflict of interest in providing any information that might allow the voter to vote more intelligently. Because why? Because if a politician could get elected without buying a lot of television ads, oh my goodness, that's a threat to their profitability.
Right.
And we can go on, and yeah, there's I agree with you. The Supreme Court decision talks about money is corporations are people, money is speech, and I would add that humans are second-class citizens in the United States of America today.
Okay,
Lon, you go ahead. I think you can go ahead.
All right. The question is the media is what it is, but the other thing is our whole program, our whole country is considered unequitable. In other words, it's not fair. And how do you change that with things like you're talking about? The other part of it is you've got Chris Hedges, you've got some of these kinds of people that can't even get a lot of their stuff out to really get it. And basically 74 million people voted for a con artist. How does that happen?
Right.
Other than propaganda.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm keying off of McChesney, who basically said that he thinks if we reinvigorate local news, right now we have relatively little investigative journalism. If we reinvigorate local news, that's going to take care of a lot of it, McChesney thinks. Now, the other thing I didn't mention is the so-called click economy. Facebook is the best and the worst in this regard, but it's not just Facebook, it's other internet companies. If you, for example, complain about illegal aliens on your Facebook account, you will likely get a stream of stories talking about crimes committed by illegal aliens and how terrible they are and so forth and so on. If, on the other hand, you talk on Facebook about undocumented, which is another term for the same thing, you will likely get research reports that say that sanctuary cities that are more friendly and supportive to these undocumented people tend to have less crime and higher median incomes. But neither side sees the news that the Facebook and the other internet companies present. So people get polarized, driven into their own echo chambers, and they don't understand what's driving the other ones. H.R. McMaster, President Trump's second national security advisor, said that Russia is using Facebook and the other internet companies to increase political polarization in this way, and so forth and so on. So I think we need to also address that, but McChesney didn't talk about that. And so, that's another issue that I think we need to address.
Okay,
Yes.
George, go ahead.
Yes, on your chart of murder statistics from 1925 to current, I noticed that the periods of the significant increase, the peak periods, were periods in which the right wing, or the slave owners at one point, the first ones, were starting to lose control and over their position. And then now we're seeing another set of peaks, secondly, that's essentially reflective of this replacement theory stuff by Tucker Carlson, that they're real fearful of the whites becoming minorities. Do you see this nonsense as being a critical thing to be attacking vigorously?
There's no question. There's a substantial literature, I don't know about substantial, but there's a modern amount of literature that basically says that that political violence is driven by changes in social status. All right. So it's not that people are necessarily all the time anti-Black or anti-Semitic or whatever. It's more that political violence comes when people see a change in social status. So when the African Americans were suddenly no longer slaves and their social status increased in the Reconstruction era, that led to the development of the Ku Klux Klan. And you can go on and on and on. But there's a book I have on ethnic violence in Eastern Europe that I forget the title, the exact title and author now, but basically it talks about a number of different cases of ethnic violence in Eastern Europe, some of what had nothing to do with anti-Semitism. And I've seen more literature that talks about that recently. So there's no question there's an issue there.
Okay, I'm going to bring the questions to a close. Also, Renee reminds us that all of our forum programs have been recorded and uploaded to YouTube for on-demand viewing, and she has put in the chat a link to do that, and we can distribute that further later. That goes to the question of Carol's question about repeating these programs. Now, finally, I just want to say, and we're going to have additional discussion after we stop recording, but I just want to remind everybody that we have a related program next week by Melinda Hindenburger, Uncovering Crime and Corruption in KCK, and that fits right into this theme. So thanks a lot for listening, and we can now turn off the recording, Renee, and go into a general